It was a typical Tuesday morning in the heart of the city when Catherine slid into the sleek leather seats of her luxury car. Her schedule was packed with back-to-back meetings, events, and social gatherings, another day in her world of wealth, prestige, and an ever-growing list of commitments. As the CEO of a successful real estate development company, Catherine was accustomed to power lunches and champagne-filled galas. She was the epitome of success, with a life that seemed too polished to touch, much less disrupt. Yet, as her car rolled down the busy street, something unusual caught her attention. Sitting on the cold sidewalk just outside a boutique shop, a man with disheveled clothes and a scruffy beard caught her gaze. His tired eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. He wasn't just another homeless man asking for spare change. There was something different about him. The way his gaze lingered, filled with unspoken stories, felt as if he were silently pleading for something more than the typical sympathy that most passers-by offered. His clothes were worn, but they didn't look like those of someone who had been on the streets for long. They spoke of better days, of a life that had fallen apart. Catherine, ever the professional, quickly shook off the strange feeling that crept into her chest. With a dismissive glance, she refocused on the road ahead. She had a meeting in less than an hour, and she needed to prepare herself for the boardroom. She had worked hard to get where she was, climbing the ranks in an industry dominated by men, always putting business first. She couldn't afford to waste time on distractions, not even one as fleeting as the look from a homeless man. But as her car sped away, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? What had brought him to this place? Catherine was no stranger to the struggles of others. After all, she had been raised in a working-class neighborhood before making her fortune. Yet the man's eyes haunted her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt an overwhelming sense of curiosity mixed with guilt. She'd seen dozens of people in need on the streets before, but this time was different. The next few days passed by in a blur of meetings, social events, and client dinners, but each time Catherine passed the spot on the street, she saw the man again. At first, he was seated, staring into the distance as if lost in thought. Other times, he stood, leaning against a wall, his head hung low, shoulders slumped in resignation. But there was always a silent strength in the way he carried himself, a dignity that Catherine couldn't ignore. Each time she drove by, she caught a glimpse of him, and each time, it gnawed at her, a feeling that she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't until the following Thursday, during a break in her day, that Catherine made the decision to stop. She had a lunch meeting scheduled, but for the first time in weeks, something inside her urged her to take a detour. She parked her car on the corner, took a deep breath, and walked across the street. As she approached the man, her heart raced with an unfamiliar uncertainty. She didn't know why she was doing this. After all, she had no time for personal matters, let alone trying to fix the problems of someone she didn't know. But there was a pull, something inexplicable urging her to reach out. The man looked up at her as she approached. His eyes were still the same, intense, searching. But this time, there was no sense of resentment or anger, only quiet acceptance. Catherine hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a few bills. "Here," she said, her voice soft. "I know it's not much, but it's something." The man's hand didn't immediately reach for the money. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile curling the corners of his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her closely, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "I don't need your money," he said quietly, "but thank you. I appreciate it." Catherine blinked in surprise. It wasn't what she expected. Most people in his position would have gladly taken the money without a second thought. But here he was, turning it down without hesitation. "What do you need then?" she asked, now genuinely curious. The man looked up at her, his eyes momentarily softening. "I just need to be seen. That's all. People walk by, look away, pretend like I don't exist." He paused, as if considering whether to reveal more. "But you saw me. That means something." Catherine stood there for a moment, taken aback by his response. She had given money to countless strangers before, but she had never once stopped to see them, really see them, the way she was seeing him now. She realized then that, in all her years of success and achievement, she had been so focused on climbing the ladder of life that she had forgotten how to connect with people on a human level. She didn't know what compelled her to do it, but the words came out before she could stop them. "I can help you. I know people, I have resources. I can offer you more than just fair change. Would you let me help you?" The man looked at her, a mixture of skepticism and something else, hope. He didn't respond immediately, but Catherine could see the battle within him, the hesitation, the disbelief. She was a stranger to him, someone who could easily walk away and forget he existed just like everyone else. But there was something in her eyes, something that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Finally, he spoke. "You can help me, but not in the way you think. It's not about the money or the job or the pity. It's about giving me the chance to change, to prove that I'm more than just a man on the streets." Catherine's heart clenched. She didn't know why she felt such a strong desire to help him. She barely knew his name, let alone his story, yet somehow she felt connected to him in a way that was hard to explain. She knew her life was about to change in a way she hadn't anticipated, and this was the moment that would mark the beginning of that transformation. With a final glance at him, she nodded. "I'm listening." As she walked away, Catherine knew that her decision would have far-reaching consequences, both for herself and for this man she had just met. She couldn't explain it, but something told her that the encounter was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. The next day, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that lingered after her encounter with James. It had been a small, fleeting moment in the grand scheme of her busy life, but it had left an imprint on her soul. She couldn't stop thinking about his eyes, the raw pain and hope that seemed to collide within them. Despite her hectic schedule, she found herself pulled back to that moment, wondering if it was a coincidence or something more significant. Maybe she could help him, or maybe, as her friends had warned her, it was just an act of misplaced sympathy. Catherine sat in her high-rise office, the glass windows offering a view of the city she had built her career in. It was quiet, the soft hum of her computer and the distant chatter of her assistant outside the door the only sounds. She was preparing for yet another meeting, this time with a group of investors interested in her latest real estate project. But as she checked her watch, she couldn't help but wonder about James. Without thinking, she picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before typing out a simple message. "Are you still on the corner?" The question seemed so out of place among the usual texts she sent. The usual messages were related to work, dinner plans, or updates from her team. But this felt different. She stared at the screen, wondering if she was making a mistake. The reply came almost immediately. "Yes, I'm still here. Waiting for something to change." Her heart skipped a beat. There was something in his words that felt almost resigned, but also a sense of expectation. It was as though he was holding on to the smallest shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, today might be the day things could be different. Catherine sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She hadn't expected him to respond so quickly. And now that he had, she realized just how serious this was. This wasn't just a casual exchange. This was someone asking for help, not in the way that most people expected, but in a way that demanded more than just charity. He wanted a chance to prove something. But what? Catherine wasn't sure, but she felt a strange pull in her chest, a desire to understand him, to give him the opportunity he was asking for. Without giving herself time to second-guess, she stood up, grabbed her coat, and left the office. She had no plans for the rest of the afternoon, and she knew exactly where she was going. As she approached the familiar street corner, her heart raced. The noise of the city seemed distant now, as if she were entering a different world altogether. There, sitting on the same spot as before, was James. His posture had changed since their last meeting. He no longer appeared defeated, but more open, as though he had shed some of the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long. Catherine walked up to him, and this time he didn't just nod at her in acknowledgement. He looked at her directly, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. There was a vulnerability there, raw and unguarded. He had been waiting for her, and in his eyes she could see the fragile thread of trust that was slowly forming between them. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually show up," he said, his voice still rough but softer than before. "I almost didn't," Catherine admitted, her heart pounding in her chest. "But something told me I should. Something told me this wasn't just a random moment." James raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You don't strike me as the kind of person who just does things on impulse." Catherine smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "I guess you don't know me as well as you think." He chuckled, but the sound was hollow, as if he hadn't laughed in a long time. "I guess not." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The street was busy with the typical hustle and bustle of the city, but in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "I need your help, Catherine," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying desperation in his tone that she hadn't noticed before. "Not just money or food. I need someone to believe that I can get out of this, to believe that I'm more than what I've become." Catherine's throat tightened. She wasn't sure why she was offering this, but it came out before she could stop it. "I believe in you." The words hung between them, heavier than any promise she had made in the past. She wasn't just offering him money or a temporary fix. She was offering him a chance, a real chance at a new life. James looked at her, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, shining in his eyes. "You don't have to do this, you know. It's a lot to ask. People don't give second chances, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't either." Catherine shook her head, her voice firm. "But I'm not everyone else, and I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to help." They both knew the weight of her words. Neither of them could predict what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This was a step into uncharted territory, one that neither of them had ever considered before. "I'll do whatever it takes," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just give me a chance." Catherine took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. She had just made a decision that could change everything, not just for James, but for her as well. This wasn't about charity. This was about belief. Belief that people could change, that people could rise above their circumstances if given the right opportunity. But what did that opportunity look like? And more importantly, what did it mean for her life? She didn't know, but as she extended her hand to him, she realized that this was just the beginning. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. "I'll help you," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Let's see what we can build together." And with that, their unlikely partnership began. What happened next would be a journey neither of them could have imagined, filled with twists, challenges, and surprises that would change their lives, and the lives of those around them, forever. Over the next few weeks, Catherine's life began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. James moved into the small guest house on her property, a modest space tucked behind her sprawling mansion. The initial awkwardness between them faded quickly as they navigated the new dynamics of their unusual arrangement. James was quiet, often retreating into himself after long days of working together on small projects. Catherine, on the other hand, threw herself into helping him, guiding him through basic tasks like updating his resume and teaching him the skills necessary to navigate the modern job market. She wasn't sure if it was just her nature to help or if, perhaps, it was a reflection of something deeper, something within her that had been dormant for years. James, for his part, struggled with the adjustment. He wasn't used to being around such luxury, let alone accepting help from someone who had everything he had once lost. He had grown used to the harsh realities of life on the streets, where every day was a fight to survive. The idea of sitting in a comfortable home, having access to food, and being able to rest without fear of someone taking it all away was foreign to him. But as the days passed, he began to show signs of hope. The flickers of confidence he had long suppressed started to resurface, though they came with an undercurrent of fear. He was scared that he wouldn't live up to Catherine's expectations, scared that he wasn't worthy of the second chance she had given him. Catherine was determined to push him beyond his comfort zone, but she also understood his hesitation. Her world was so different from his, and she couldn't pretend to fully understand his pain. But what she did know was that she believed in him. She had seen something in his eyes that day, something that told her he wasn't just a homeless man. He wasn't just a failure. From that moment on, Catherine knew that she was all in. Whatever happened, she would stand by James. Because this wasn't just about helping him. It was about discovering something deep within herself, something she hadn't even known she was searching for. And as the sun set behind her mansion, Catherine finally understood the most important lesson of all, that sometimes taking a risk on someone else meant taking the greatest risk of all, believing in the possibility of a new beginning. As the months passed, Catherine and James grew more comfortable with the new dynamics of their unusual partnership. James's landscaping business, though still in its infancy, had begun to gain traction. He was booking more jobs, gaining positive reviews from clients, and slowly but surely, his confidence was growing. Catherine watched with a sense of quiet pride as he learned to navigate the world of business, the world she had spent years mastering. She had seen him at his lowest, but now she was seeing him rise, piece by piece, as he rebuilt his life. But while things were improving, they were far from perfect. The challenges didn't just disappear because he had a new start. They only evolved into something more complicated. Catherine began to notice changes in herself as well. She found herself prioritizing James's success almost as much as her own. Their partnership had deepened into something more personal. She would spend hours talking with him after work, discussing his plans, encouraging him when he doubted himself. But as close as they were becoming, there was still something unspoken between them, a tension that neither of them addressed directly. It was as if both of them were afraid to voice the possibility of something more than just a professional relationship. Catherine wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the fear of complicating things, or perhaps it was the lingering doubts from her past experiences that held her back. At the same time, the external pressure was starting to mount. Catherine's circle of friends and business associates had not been silent about their concerns. They didn't understand her growing attachment to James. They were uncomfortable with the idea that she was mixing business with charity, especially when there was so much at risk. Her social events became filled with pointed glances and hushed conversations behind her back. "What does she see in him?" they would ask in private, their judgments unspoken but palpable. Catherine had brushed off their opinions for months, but it was starting to wear on her. One evening, at a high-profile gala that Catherine had attended every year without fail, things came to a head. The event was held at a luxurious venue, a grand ballroom filled with the city's elite. Catherine, as usual, was the center of attention, graciously accepting compliments on her latest real estate deals and socializing with her peers. As she walked across the room, she overheard a conversation between two of her closest friends. "Did you hear?" one of them asked, her voice lowered but clearly audible. "Catherine's really gone off the deep end. She's wasting her time on that homeless man. She thinks she can fix him, but he's a lost cause. It's pathetic, really." The words hit Catherine like a punch to the stomach. She paused in her tracks, trying to compose herself, but it was as if time had stopped. The weight of their judgment hung in the air around her. She wasn't used to being criticized so openly, not in her own social circle. She had always been the one who held the power, who made the decisions. Taking a deep breath, Catherine composed herself and walked over to them with a forced smile. "I think I've had enough of this conversation," she said coldly, her tone a sharp contrast to the warmth she usually exuded. The room fell silent as she stood before them, her expression unwavering. "I don't need anyone's approval to make the decisions that matter in my life. And right now, what matters is that I believe in someone, and I'm willing to help him, whether or not you understand it." The room was quiet, and Catherine could feel the weight of the moment hanging between them. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. Finally, one of her friends tried to recover, laughing awkwardly. "I didn't mean to upset you, Catherine. I just—" "No," Catherine interrupted, her voice firm. "You didn't upset me, but you've made it clear where you stand, and I'm not going to let your opinions shape my choices." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in a long time, Catherine felt a rush of defiance. That night, as she returned to her mansion, she was still stewing from the confrontation. She had always prided herself on being in control of every situation. But this was different. James was different. He wasn't just a business opportunity or a project to fix. He was a person, and more than that, he was someone who had become a part of her life. But now, in the face of her social circle's judgment, Catherine was starting to question everything. Was she making a mistake? Was she losing herself in this desire to help him? When she arrived home, she found James in the living room, sitting with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. He turned as she entered, and his eyes softened when he saw the expression on her face. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice full of concern. Catherine took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a long night." James didn't press further, but the tension between them was palpable. They had grown close, but there were things they hadn't talked about, things they were both avoiding. Catherine felt a surge of frustration as she stood there, unsure of how to explain what she was feeling. "James," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "do you ever think about why I'm doing this? Why I'm helping you?" James looked at her, his gaze steady but gentle. "I think I know why," he said quietly. "You see something in me. You see the person I could be. But you don't have to keep helping me, Catherine. I'm not your charity case." Catherine shook her head, her throat tightening. "It's not that. I'm not doing this because I think you're broken. I'm doing this because I believe in you. But it's getting harder, James. The world, my world, it's not understanding what I'm doing. They don't get it." James stood up and walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his touch grounding her. "You don't need their approval, Catherine," he said softly. "What matters is that you believe in me. What matters is that we're doing this together." Catherine looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she felt the weight of everything they had been through. The uncertainty, the risks, the doubts, lift just a little. She had been so consumed by the opinions of others that she had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered, the choice she had made to invest in him, and the connection they had built. But just as Catherine felt a sense of peace, a new challenge loomed ahead. The pressure from her social circle was only growing, and soon James would face something that would test both their resolve, something neither of them could have predicted. It was clear that their journey was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. As the weeks turned into months, Catherine and James had made steady progress, but the external pressures continued to grow. James's landscaping business had started to show real promise. He had secured several larger contracts, and his name was becoming known in the local community. Catherine was proud of how far he had come, but the scrutiny from her friends, her colleagues, and even the media was becoming unbearable. Every time they went out in public, the whispers followed. What's she doing with him? Why doesn't she date someone her own level? The questions weren't always spoken out loud, but Catherine could feel them in the air. An unspoken judgment, a tension that followed them wherever they went. Despite the success of his business, James still struggled with the psychological scars of his past. He was a different man than he had been when Catherine first met him on the streets, but some things, Deep insecurities, a fear of failure, lingered. He had come so far, but the fear of losing it all haunted him. It wasn't just the pressure from the outside world that made him uneasy. It was the pressure he put on himself. Every day, he felt like he had to prove he was worthy of Catherine's belief in him. But the more he worked, the more that doubt crept in. What if he wasn't really capable of this new life? What if, deep down, he was still that broken man, still unworthy of success or happiness? Catherine, too, felt the weight of their situation. She had always been strong, confident, and capable, but this was different. There was an intimacy to their relationship, an emotional depth that neither of them had anticipated. The more she spent time with James, the more she realized how much she had invested in him, not just in his business, but in him as a person. He had become someone she cared about deeply, someone who had redefined what it meant to be truly successful. But it wasn't just about helping him anymore. She was emotionally tied to the outcome of his journey, and that made everything more complicated. One evening after a long day of work, Catherine found herself at a crossroads. She had been invited to another gala, this time one of the most prestigious events of the year. It was an invitation that came with its own set of expectations. She was expected to show up with a companion, to represent her status in society. Her friends and colleagues would be there. And as usual, there would be whispers about her life choices. The thought of going alone was unthinkable, but bringing James felt like a bigger challenge. Would they understand him? Would he fit in? Would he be comfortable in a world that had once felt so foreign to him? Catherine stood before her mirror, her reflection staring back at her, trying to decide. She had already called James to let him know about the event. His response was simple but filled with hesitation. "I don't know if I belong in that world," he had said quietly. "I've never been part of that life, and I'm afraid of messing up." The words stuck with her, echoing in her mind. James had come so far, but this was a test. This event was more than just a social gathering. It was a symbol of everything that had separated their worlds. He could no longer hide behind his past, nor could she deny the differences between them. The question was, could they truly bridge the gap? Could they stand together in a world that still viewed them as outsiders? The night of the gala arrived, and Catherine found herself pacing in her living room, unsure of what to do. Her dress, an elegant black gown, shimmered under the soft lighting, but it felt like a costume, like she was preparing for a performance, not a celebration. James had been quiet all day, and Catherine knew he was nervous, uncertain of what this night would mean for them. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of emotions, both exhilarating and daunting. For Catherine and James, the success of the night marked more than just a social victory. It was a turning point, a moment that had solidified their bond in a way neither of them had fully anticipated. James, though still struggling with his insecurities, had begun to truly believe in himself, and for the first time in a long time, he could see a future that wasn't clouded by his past. Catherine, too, had been transformed. She had not only helped a man rebuild his life, but she had also discovered something deep within herself, a courage she hadn't known existed, a willingness to fight for what was right, even when the world around her doubted her decisions. But their journey was far from over, and the next challenge would test them both in ways they hadn't yet imagined. It started with a phone call that Catherine never saw coming. One morning, as she was wrapping up a meeting in her office, her assistant delivered the message. "There's someone here to see you, Catherine. He says it's urgent." Catherine raised an eyebrow. No one ever showed up unannounced at her office. She was used to planned meetings, clients, and the occasional social visit from friends, but this was different. Her mind raced as she wondered who it could be. The last person she expected to see was James's ex-wife, a woman who had left James during the lowest point of his life, a woman who had been part of the reason he had fallen from grace. Catherine's stomach twisted as the assistant escorted her into the conference room, where she found Maria, James's ex, sitting across from her with an air of cold determination. "Catherine," Maria said, her voice clipped, "I know you've been helping James, And while I can't say I'm happy about it, I understand the situation. But I need you to know something. James isn't who you think he is." Catherine stiffened, but kept her voice steady. "What are you talking about?" Maria leaned in, her eyes narrowing. James was once a very different man. He was a businessman, successful, well-respected. But after the accident, well, things change. He's not the same person anymore. And you're taking a huge risk by getting involved with him. He has a history, Catherine. A history I don't think you're aware of." Catherine's mind began to spin. She had heard bits and pieces of James' past, but she didn't know the full story. She had never pressed him too hard on it. She hadn't needed to. But now, sitting across from Maria, the pieces started to fall into place. James had never been a perfect man, and she knew there were things he had yet to share with her. But what was Maria trying to say? And why now? "Are you trying to scare me?" Catherine asked, her voice calm, though her heart was racing. "Because it's not going to work. I know James. I see him for who he is now, not who he was." Maria sighed and looked down at her hands. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to protect you. You're in way over your head, Catherine. James's demons are deeper than you realize. They don't just go away because he's found success again." Catherine wasn't sure what Maria meant by demons, but she felt a pang of doubt creep into her thoughts. She had been so focused on James's potential, on the progress they had made together, that she hadn't stopped to consider the full weight of his past. Was there something darker she didn't know? "I don't need your approval, Maria," Catherine said firmly. "I'm not here to judge James based on the past. He's not the man he used to be. And if you think you can walk in here and scare me off, you're wrong. James has changed, and I'm not going anywhere." Maria stood up, her eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and something else. "Regret, maybe. You're making a mistake. I tried to warn you." Catherine watched as Maria walked out of the room, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The encounter left Catherine shaken. She had never considered the possibility that James might be hiding something more than just his failed marriage or his years of homelessness. She had believed in him, but now, doubts began to gnaw at her. Could she really trust him? And more importantly, could he trust himself? That evening, Catherine found James sitting outside in the garden, his back to her as he stared at the setting sun. There was an air of quiet contemplation around him, and Catherine felt her heart ache for him. He had come so far, and yet she could sense that there was still something unspoken between them. It had been building for days, an unspoken tension that neither of them wanted to address. She had always prided herself on being able to handle any situation, but now, facing James, she felt the vulnerability of their relationship in a way she hadn't before. "James," she said softly, walking toward him, "we need to talk." He turned to her, his eyes tired, yet searching. "About what?" "About your past," Catherine said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "Maria came to see me today. She told me things I didn't know." James's face hardened at the mention of his ex-wife's name. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Catherine could see the pain in his eyes, the ghost of his past still clinging to him. "What did she tell you?" he asked, his voice low, almost guarded. "She told me that you're not who you seem to be," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice gentle. "She said you've got demons you're not dealing with." James's eyes flashed with anger, but there was also a deep sadness there. "Maria doesn't know anything about me anymore," he said, his voice rough. "She left me when I needed her the most. And now she's using my past to try to destroy what I've worked so hard to rebuild." Catherine's heart sank as she realized how deeply the wounds from his past still cut. "What happened, James? What is she talking about?" James stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for my life to fall apart. But it did. I made mistakes, big ones, and Maria wasn't there to help me pick up the pieces. Now she wants to use my mistakes against me." Catherine took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. "James, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be honest with me. If we're going to make this work, we can't keep hiding from the past." For a long moment, there was silence between them. The weight of their conversation seemed to hang in the air, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you, Catherine, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if you know everything about me, you won't be able to look at me the same way." Catherine reached out, taking his hand in hers. "James," she said softly, "I've seen who you are now. I've seen the man who's trying, who's working every day to make a better life. That's the man I believe in. I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, everything changed. Catherine realized that love wasn't about perfect people. It was about accepting each other's flaws, embracing the scars of the past, and working together to create something new. They had both come so far, but the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more questions, and more obstacles to overcome. But as long as they faced them together, Catherine knew they would both be stronger for it. The next few days were a blur of emotions, but through it all, one thing remained clear: their bond had been tested, and it had survived. Catherine and James had come to the realization that no matter what the world threw at them, they were in this together. There were still scars to heal, but the foundation of their relationship had been built on trust, belief, and the strength they had found in each other. As they walked forward, side by side, Catherine knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about helping someone find redemption. It was about building a life, together, one step at a time. And in that moment, she understood that sometimes the greatest love stories were the ones that started from the most unexpected places.